A German infantryman crouches in a crater outside a Belgian town on December 17, 1944. His training told him that 200 cartridges would suffice for most engagements. Now, checking his pouches, he finds only 43 remain. In just 2 hours of fighting, he has expended 157 rounds. The American forces across the frozen landscape continue their relentless barrage. The sound differs entirely from anything experienced during 2 years on the Eastern Front, rather than the deliberate crack of aimed rifle shots. This resembles a sustained thunder of overlapping gunfire emanating from every direction simultaneously. Individual weapons can be distinguished, the sharp bark of M1 Garand rifles discharging their 8-round clips, but the overall impression creates a continuous wall of noise. Projectiles snap through the air overhead. Rounds impact the frozen earth nearby, throwing up small fountains of dirt and snow. The lip of the shell crater gradually disintegrates under the impact of countless bullets. The soldier presses himself against the cold ground and attempts to comprehend what he hears. The American position cannot contain more than 30 or 40 men. His own unit, what remains after the morning's failed assault, numbers perhaps 50. The Americans should be conserving ammunition, firing carefully, making each shot meaningful. Instead, they shoot as though their supply were infinite. He risks a glance over the crater's edge. Muzzle flashes ripple from the American positions. He ducks back down as bullets crack past his head. During training, instructors taught that an infantry company carried approximately 30,000 rounds of rifle ammunition distributed among its soldiers. The instructors emphasized that this represented a finite resource requiring careful management throughout an engagement. Fire discipline was not merely doctrine, it meant survival. An infantryman who exhausted his ammunition became a burden to his unit. The Americans appear not to have received this instruction. The squad leader lies dead in the field 20 meters behind, struck down during the assault. During a brief lull 30 minutes earlier, the soldier checked the body. The squad leader had been carrying 4 ammunition pouches. The standard load, 3 pouches were empty. The 4th contained 11 rounds. The squad leader died trying to conserve ammunition, while the Americans maintained their sustained fire. This violates everything understood about infantry combat. Soviet infantry sometimes attacked in waves, despite heavy casualties. But even they eventually stopped shooting. They ran out of bullets. Everyone ran out of bullets. That was the fundamental mathematics of infantry warfare. Each soldier carried a specific load. That load represented the maximum amount of fighting he could accomplish before requiring resupply. Commanders planned operations around this constraint, but the Americans continue shooting. The soldier is down to 43 rounds. The attack that was supposed to break through to the Meuse River has stalled in a frozen Belgian field because the men around him are running out of ammunition, while their opponents show no sign of slowing their fire. Something is fundamentally different about the American approach to infantry combat. The 200 rounds in his pouches represent not a tactical advantage, but a strategic miscalculation. German infantry doctrine was not arbitrary. It was the product of careful military thinking stretching back decades, rooted in a specific philosophy about how infantry should fight and what made soldiers effective on modern battlefields. The German army of 1944 inherited Prussian military traditions emphasizing training, discipline, and efficient use of resources. These were not merely cultural values. They were tactical necessities for a nation that had fought the previous war on 2 fronts and been strangled by blockade. German infantry training in the years leading to the Second World War focused intensively on marksmanship. Every soldier was expected to be a competent marksman, capable of hitting man-sized targets at ranges up to 400 meters. This was not a suggestion. It was a requirement for graduation from basic training. Recruits spent weeks on rifle ranges firing under supervision of experienced non-commissioned officers who had themselves been trained in the tradition of aimed fire. The instructors emphasized that every round fired should have a purpose and a goal. Ammunition was expensive. It had to be manufactured, transported, and distributed. Wasting it through inaccurate or suppressive fire was inefficient and tactically unsound. The standard ammunition load for a German infantryman reflected this philosophy. Each soldier carried 60 rounds into ammunition pouches, with an additional 60 rounds in stripper clips carried in various pockets and pouches. A further 60 rounds were carried in the soldier's pack, and 20 rounds were typically kept in reserve position with unit supply. This gave a total basic load of 200 rounds per person. The division of ammunition was deliberate. The first 120 rounds carried in pouches, and on the person represented the soldier's immediate combat load. The 60 rounds in the pack were operational reserve accessed when the tactical situation allowed. The final 20 rounds with unit supply were for emergency resupply or sustained operations. This system assumed that infantry combat would follow a specific pattern. Squads would maneuver into position. Soldiers would identify targets. They would fire aimed shots at those targets. They would advance or withdraw based on tactical situation. Throughout this process, they would conserve ammunition, firing only when they had identified a target worth engaging. The squad leader and company commander would control the rate of fire, ensuring the unit did not exhaust its ammunition before accomplishing its mission or before resupply could be arranged. German military theorists believe this approach represented the highest evolution of infantry tactics. It combined firepower with economy of force. It emphasized quality over quantity. A well-trained German soldier who fired 100 carefully aimed rounds was, in theory, more effective than a poorly trained soldier who fired 1,000 rounds wildly in the general direction of the enemy. This was not merely Prussian arrogance. It was based on mathematical analysis of hit probability, ammunition consumption rates, and the logistical burden of supplying ammunition to forward units. The doctrine had worked in Poland, where German infantry overwhelmed Polish defenders through superior training and coordination. It worked in France, where the speed of German armored columns and precision of German infantry attacks broke the French army in 6 weeks. It even worked after a fashion on the Eastern Front, where German marksmanship and fire discipline inflicted enormous casualties on Soviet forces. German soldiers learned to trust their training. They learned that careful aim and controlled fire were more effective than spray and pray tactics they associated with less disciplined armies. They learned that 200 rounds properly used would see them through most combat situations. What they did not learn, because their instructors did not know, was that this doctrine assumed the enemy was fighting under similar constraints. It assumed that both sides were managing finite resources, and that the side which used those resources more efficiently would prevail. It assumed that ammunition supply was a limiting factor for everyone, and that tactical success came from making better use of limited ammunition rather than having access to effectively unlimited quantities. These assumptions were about to collide with American industrial capacity and the fundamentally different philosophy about how infantry should fight. The German ammunition supply system that supported the 200-round load was sophisticated but constrained. Germany had entered the Second World War with a modern armaments industry, but that industry operated under limitations that would become more severe as the war progressed. The manufacture of small arms ammunition had brass for cartridge cases, lead for bullets, and various chemicals for propellant and primers. Germany had limited domestic sources of these materials. Copper necessary for brass production had to be imported or obtained from occupied territories. Lead was more readily available but still finite. The chemicals required for propellant manufacture demanded industrial capacity that was also needed for artillery ammunition, grenades, and countless other military supplies. German ammunition factories in 1944 were producing approximately 100 million rounds of rifle ammunition per month. This sounds like an enormous quantity until divided among the millions of German soldiers fighting on multiple fronts. The Eastern Front alone consumed vast quantities of ammunition. German infantry divisions fighting Soviet forces sometimes exhausted their basic loads in sustained engagements and had to wait for resupply trains that might take days to arrive. The situation in the West was somewhat better because Allied bombing had not yet completely disrupted German logistics, but the fundamental constraint remained. Germany could only produce so much ammunition, and that production had to be distributed among all the nation's forces. The German military had learned harsh lessons about logistics in the previous war. The British naval blockade during the First World War had strangled German imports, creating severe shortages of raw materials. Ammunition had been rationed. Soldiers had been ordered to conserve rounds. German military planners of the 1930s remembered these constraints and built an army that could function within them. The emphasis on marksmanship and fire discipline was not merely about tactical effectiveness. It was about creating a military force that could sustain itself on limited industrial output. This philosophy was reinforced by German experiences in the interwar period. The Reichswehr, the German army of the Weimar Republic, had been limited by the Treaty of Versailles to 100,000 men. This small professional force had emphasized quality over quantity. Every soldier received extensive training. Standards were high. The culture of the Reichswehr valued precision, discipline, and efficiency. When Germany began expanding its military in the 1930s in violation of Versailles, the expanded Wehrmacht inherited these values. Officers and non-commissioned officers who had served in the Reichswehr trained the new recruits, passing on the emphasis on aimed fire and ammunition conservation. The German ammunition load of 200 rounds made sense within this context. It represented a balance between giving the soldier enough ammunition to fight effectively and not overburdening him with weight. A German infantry soldier in 1944 carried approximately 30 kilograms of equipment, including his rifle, ammunition, grenades, entrenching tool, gas mask, rations, and personal items. The 200 rounds of rifle ammunition, weighing approximately 2 kilograms, were a significant but manageable portion of this load. Increasing the basic load would have required reducing something else or accepting that soldiers would be more fatigued on the march. German logistics officers calculated that 200 rounds per man represented approximately 2 days of sustained combat for an infantry division. Assuming normal engagement patterns, ammunition resupply would arrive from division stocks every 48 to 72 hours, replenishing the infantry's basic load. In practice, this system worked adequately when German forces were on the offensive and supply lines were short. It worked less well during defensive operations or when supply lines were disrupted. But the same could be said of any logistics system. The fundamental assumption was that both sides operated under similar constraints, that both German and enemy infantry had to manage their ammunition carefully, and that the side with better training and fire discipline would make more effective use of limited supplies. This assumption was about to be tested against an opponent whose industrial capacity and logistical philosophy were fundamentally different. The United States Army that German forces faced in Belgium in December 1944 did not think about ammunition as a scarce resource to be carefully conserved. The Americans thought about ammunition as a tool to be used liberally to accomplish the mission while minimizing casualties, and they had the industrial capacity to support that philosophy. The American infantryman carried a fundamentally different combat load based on a fundamentally different philosophy about how infantry should fight. The standard American basic load in December 1944 was 80 rounds of 30-06 ammunition, carried in a cloth bandolier worn over the shoulder, plus an additional 48 rounds carried in the belt. This gave each rifleman carrying the M1 Garand a total of 128 rounds on his person. But this was not the complete story. American infantry doctrine called for additional ammunition to be distributed throughout the unit in ways that dramatically increased the actual amount available to frontline soldiers. Each American infantry squad included a Browning automatic rifleman who carried 360 rounds for his weapon. The squad also included riflemen designated as ammunition bearers who carried additional bandoliers of rifle ammunition, sometimes as many as 4 or 5 extra bandoliers beyond their own basic load. Each bandolier contained 48 rounds. An American rifleman designated as an ammunition bearer might be carrying 224 rounds or more on his person. When the squad needed ammunition in engagement, these extra bandoliers were distributed to men whose basic loads were running low. American ammunition supply doctrine emphasized abundance and availability. Unit supply personnel were instructed to push ammunition forward aggressively. Ammunition was not something to be carefully rationed. It was something to be used. The United States Army Logistics Manual from 1944 specified that rifle ammunition should be resupplied at a rate sufficient to maintain basic loads, even during sustained combat operations. In practice, this meant that American infantry companies rarely had to worry about running out of ammunition in engagement. Resupply came from battalion stocks, which came from regimental stocks, which came from division supply points, which were fed by an industrial and logistical system of staggering capacity. The American approach to infantry combat emphasized firepower over individual marksmanship. This was not because American training was inferior. American soldiers received adequate marksmanship instruction, but the tactical doctrine did not assume that every shot had to count. Instead, American infantry tactics relied on establishing fire superiority through volume. When an American squad made contact with enemy forces, the doctrine called for immediate and sustained return fire. The objective was to suppress the enemy, to force them to take cover, to create conditions where American forces could maneuver or call for support from mortar, artillery, or armor. This approach had been developed through experience in North Africa, Sicily, and Italy, and had been refined through the fighting in France after D-Day. American commanders had observed that German infantry, while well-trained and disciplined, could be overwhelmed by sustained fire. German soldiers who were trained to aim carefully and fire precisely became less effective when they were forced to keep their heads down by a continuous barrage of incoming fire. The American answer to German fire discipline was not better fire discipline. It was more fire. The M1 Garand rifle was perfectly suited to this philosophy. It held 8 rounds in an N-block clip that was loaded from the top of the action. When the last round was fired, the clip ejected automatically with a distinctive ping, and the soldier could immediately load a fresh clip. An experienced rifleman could reload in 3 to 4 seconds. The semi-automatic action meant that a soldier could fire aim shots as quickly as he could pull the trigger without having to manually work a bolt between rounds. In practical terms, this meant that an American infantryman could fire his 8-round clip in 5 to 10 seconds, reload, and continue firing. German soldiers facing American infantry frequently reported being surprised by the rate of fire from American positions. What sounded like multiple machine guns was often just several Garands firing in sustained rhythm. The psychological effect was significant. German infantry, who were accustomed to hearing the slower crack of bolt-action rifles, were unprepared for the continuous roar of semi-automatic fire. The sound itself was suppressive, making it difficult to determine how many Americans were actually shooting and from exactly where. The American ammunition supply system that supported this rate of fire was built on the industrial capacity of the United States. American ammunition plants produced approximately 8 billion rounds of .30-06 ammunition in the Second World War. This is not an error. 8 billion rounds. To put this in perspective, Germany produced approximately 1.2 billion rounds of rifle ammunition in the entire war. The American production advantage was more than 6 to 1, and this does not account for the fact that American production was sustained and increasing throughout the war, while German production declined as Allied bombing intensified and raw materials became scarcer. American ammunition was manufactured at facilities across the United States. Lake City Army Ammunition Plant in Missouri, which began production in 1941, could produce 5 million rounds of small arms ammunition per day at peak capacity. The facility employed thousands of workers, many of them women, operating around the clock in 3 shifts. Frankfurt Arsenal in Philadelphia, Twin Cities Arsenal in Minnesota, and Denver Ordnance Plant in Colorado all contributed to the enormous output. These factories were protected from bombing, had unlimited access to raw materials, and operated in an economy fully mobilized for war production. The ammunition produced at these plants was shipped to ports, loaded onto Liberty ships, transported across the Atlantic, unloaded in England or France, moved to depot stockpiles, distributed to army supply points, and pushed forward to division and regimental stocks. From there, it went to battalion supply, to company supply, and finally to the individual soldier. This supply chain moved millions of rounds every week. American logistics doctrine assumed that ammunition would be consumed in large quantities and planned accordingly. The system was designed to deliver abundance. The German soldier crouching in a shell hole with 43 rounds remaining was fighting against this system. He was a well-trained soldier with excellent fire discipline, facing an opponent who had been trained in a different philosophy and supplied by an industrial base that could support that philosophy with effectively unlimited ammunition. The 200 rounds in his pouches represented Germany's best effort to create an efficient, sustainable infantry force. The continuous fire coming from American positions represented a nation that had chosen a different path, one that relied not on efficiency but on overwhelming material superiority. The first time the German infantryman had encountered American infantry in sustained combat was 6 days earlier during the initial German offensive. His regiment had attacked at dawn on December 16th, moving through the Ardennes forest with the objective of reaching the Meuse River before American reinforcements could arrive. The plan called for a rapid movement, overwhelming local defenses through surprise and concentration of force, and pushing forward before the Americans could organize an effective response. His company had been optimistic. They were part of a major offensive, the first German attack in the West in months. They had new equipment, winter uniforms, and full ammunition loads. The attack had gone well initially. American positions in the forward areas had been thinly held, manned by units that were either inexperienced or exhausted from earlier fighting. The company had overrun several positions, capturing American soldiers who seemed shocked by the sudden German assault. But as the advance continued, the resistance stiffened. American units that had not been in the initial contact area began moving toward the sound of gunfire. Reinforcements arrived. The easy breakthrough became a hard fight. The first sustained firefight with American infantry occurred on the second day of the offensive. His platoon had been ordered to clear a small village that sat astride the road they needed to use for their advance. The village appeared lightly defended. Reconnaissance had reported perhaps a platoon of Americans, maybe 40 men, occupying buildings on the eastern edge. The German attack began with a brief mortar barrage, followed by an assault by 2 platoons, moving in coordinated bounds. His squad was part of the first wave. They had advanced to within 200 meters of the American positions when the firing started. He had expected the sharp crack of aimed rifle fire, the tactical pause as defenders worked their bolts and acquired new targets, the pattern of combat he had learned on the Eastern Front. Instead, the air filled with the continuous roar of overlapping fire. Bullets snapped past his head. Rounds struck the ground around him. The tree he had taken cover behind was hit multiple times, bark exploding in fragments. He pressed himself into the cold earth and tried to locate individual shooters so he could return fire effectively. He could not identify individual shooters because they were all shooting at once. The American position erupted in muzzle flashes. He could see rifles firing from windows, from behind walls, from positions in the tree line behind the village, but instead of the methodical aimed fire he expected, The Americans were firing in rapid succession. He watched one window. A rifle appeared, fired once, twice, 3 times in quick succession, then disappeared. Another rifle appeared in a different window, more fire. The soldier did not seem to be carefully aiming between shots. He was firing as fast as he could pull the trigger, and only then ducking back into cover, he returned fire. He had a clear line of sight to one of the windows. He aimed carefully, controlled his breathing, and squeezed the trigger. His carabiner 98K barked and kicked against his shoulder. He worked the bolt, ejecting the spent casing and chambering a fresh round. He aimed again. He fired again. He had fired 4 rounds at the window when bullets began striking the tree trunk inches from his head. He rolled to his right, seeking better cover, and saw another soldier lying in the open 10 meters away. The man had been hit multiple times. He was not moving. The firefight continued for 20 minutes. His squad had started with 9 men. By the time they broke contact and fell back to covered positions, they were down to 6. He had fired 38 rounds. He had been in combat for less than half an hour, and he had used nearly 1/5 of his total ammunition load. He had no idea how many Americans he had hit, if any. The volume of fire from the American position had not decreased noticeably despite the German return fire. The Americans had not slacked their fire to conserve ammunition. They had not paused to allow their barrels to cool. They had simply kept shooting. That evening during the company reorganization, soldiers compared notes. The pattern was the same everywhere. American infantry fought differently than German infantry. They did not fire carefully aimed shots at identified targets. They fired rapidly, sometimes seemingly at random, creating a continuous stream of bullets that made movement dangerous and advance nearly impossible. German soldiers who attempted to maneuver were hit. German soldiers who remained in cover were pinned down by the sustained fire. The tactical situation that German doctrine assumed, where both sides would fire methodically and maneuver during lulls in the engagement, did not exist when fighting Americans. The lieutenant gathered the surviving squad leaders and discussed the situation. Several men reported that they had spent more ammunition than expected. One squad leader stated that 2 of his men were down to fewer than 50 rounds after a single engagement. The lieutenant had no immediate solution. Regiment had promised that ammunition resupply would come forward that night, but the tactical situation was unclear. American counterattacks had disrupted some supply routes. The promised rapid breakthrough had not materialized. German forces were engaged in sustained combat, exactly the type of fighting that consumed ammunition faster than the supply system could replace it. Over the following days, as the German offensive ground forward against increasing resistance, soldiers accumulated evidence that their assumptions about infantry combat were no longer valid. The Americans they faced were not conserving ammunition. They were not firing carefully aimed shots at identified targets. They were shooting constantly, in volumes that seemed impossible given the constraints understood to govern infantry combat, and they showed no signs of running out. On the 3rd day of the offensive, the company overran an American position that had been hastily abandoned. The soldiers had retreated in good order, taking their weapons and most of their equipment, but they had left behind supplies that revealed something about how American logistics worked. Soldiers searched a dugout that had served as a squad position. They found empty ammunition cans, dozens of them stacked against one wall. Each can had held 220 rounds of 30-06 ammunition. One soldier counted 17 empty cans that represented 3,740 rounds that had been consumed by a single American squad position, probably no more than 10-12 men, during perhaps 2 days of fighting. He did the mathematics. His entire 30-man platoon carried 6,000 rounds total when at full basic load. This single American squad position had fired more than half that amount in a fraction of the time, and the Americans had not appeared to be running low when they withdrew. They had left in an organized fashion, taking their weapons and presumably whatever ammunition remained. The empty cans represented ammunition that had been fired, not ammunition that had been abandoned because it was too heavy to carry, or because resupply had made it unnecessary. The dugout also contained unopened cases of rations, clean socks, cigarettes, and medical supplies. The abundance was striking. These American soldiers had not been on short rations or limited supply. They had been living well, even in a forward position, under combat conditions. He thought about his own situation. His company had been on half rations for 3 days, because supply trucks had been delayed by American air attacks on the roads. They had been told to conserve food and ammunition, because resupply was uncertain. The Americans they were fighting appeared to have no such constraints. Other German soldiers reported similar observations. One squad had captured an American supply truck that had been abandoned when its driver was wounded. The truck contained, among other supplies, 48 cases of rifle ammunition. Each case held 800 rounds. The single truck carried enough ammunition to resupply a German infantry company 3 times over, and it was just one truck among many in the American logistics system. A captured American soldier, when interrogated, stated casually that ammunition was never a problem. He said that his company received regular resupply, that ammunition was available whenever they needed it, and that he had never been told to conserve rounds. He seemed surprised by the question, as if the idea of running out of ammunition when combat was foreign to him. German intelligence officers compiled these reports and attempted to understand what they meant for the operational situation. The evidence suggested that American infantry were supported by a logistics system that operated on fundamentally different assumptions than German logistics. The Americans were not carefully managing scarce resources. They were distributing abundant resources with the expectation that they would be consumed. This suggested an industrial base and supply chain of extraordinary capacity, one that could sustain high rates of consumption across multiple armies fighting on multiple fronts. Some German officers drew the correct conclusion from this evidence. The Americans had access to effectively unlimited ammunition because American industry could produce ammunition faster than American soldiers could fire it, and American logistics could deliver that ammunition to forward positions despite the distances involved and the tactical situation. This meant that German infantry, no matter how well trained or disciplined, were fighting at a permanent disadvantage. Their 200 rounds per man represented Germany's best effort to arm its soldiers adequately within the constraints of German industrial capacity. The American soldiers' 220 rounds plus additional bandoliers represented merely the amount that American logistics officers had determined was practical for a soldier to carry, not the upper limit of what could be supplied. The German soldier understood none of the strategic implications. He only knew that he was in a shell hole with 43 rounds remaining, that the Americans across the field were still shooting, and that the resupply that was supposed to have arrived the previous night had not come. He knew that his squad leader was dead, that half of his squad were casualties, and that the attack they had launched with such confidence was stalled in frozen Belgian mud. He knew that every time he raised his head to look for a target, bullets cracked past in quantities that made aimed return fire nearly suicidal. What he did not know yet, what German infantry throughout the Ardennes were learning in those December days of 1944, was that the 200 rounds they carried represented not a tactical asset, but a strategic deficit. They were fighting an opponent who had made different choices about how to arm and supply infantry, and those choices were enabled by an industrial and logistical system that Germany could not match. The mathematics were brutal and simple. German soldiers fired 200 rounds and had to wait for resupply. American soldiers fired 200 rounds and had more ammunition in bandoliers and more coming from company supply and more behind that in battalion stocks, all supported by factories that could produce millions of rounds per day and a merchant fleet that could move that ammunition across an ocean and a logistics system that could push it forward to the men who needed it. The German soldier survived the fighting at Saint-Vith. although his company did not survive as an effective fighting unit. By the evening of December 17th, after sustained combat against American positions, his platoon had been reduced to 14 men from its original strength of 37. More significantly, the surviving soldiers had exhausted most of their ammunition. He himself had 11 rounds remaining. The promised resupply had failed to arrive because American counterattacks had cut several supply routes, and the logistics system that was supposed to support the German offensive was already breaking down under the strain of sustained combat and Allied air attacks on roads and rail lines. The company commander made the decision to withdraw to defensive positions and await resupply before attempting further offensive action. This decision, repeated across dozens of German units throughout the Ardennes, marked the practical end of the offensive as originally conceived. The rapid breakthrough that was supposed to reach the Meuse River in 3 days had stalled after 2 days because German infantry could not sustain the rate of advance against American resistance. And a significant factor in that failure was something as prosaic as ammunition supply. German after-action reports from the Ardennes offensive, compiled in the months after the battle, included numerous references to ammunition shortages at critical moments. Companies reported having to break off attacks because forward units had exhausted their basic loads. Battalions reported delays in offensive operations while waiting for ammunition to be brought forward. Regimental commanders noted that the rate of ammunition consumption exceeded planning estimates, particularly when engaged against American infantry, who maintained sustained fire even when German forces attempted to suppress them. The ammunition shortage was not the only factor in the German defeat, or even the primary factor, but it was symptomatic of a larger problem. Germany was fighting a war of limited resources against opponents with effectively unlimited resources, and this disparity manifested itself in countless small ways that accumulated into strategic defeat. The United States produced approximately 8 billion rounds of .30-06 ammunition alone, not counting ammunition for other weapons. In less than 4 years of wartime production, American factories in 1944 were producing more ammunition in a single month than Germany produced in half a year. This disparity extended beyond ammunition to every category of military supply. American soldiers in Europe received regular resupply of food, clothing, medical supplies, and equipment. German soldiers in the final year of the war were often on short rations, wore patched uniforms, and made do with whatever equipment could be scrounged or captured. The American logistics system could deliver fresh socks and hot meals to forward positions. The German logistics system struggled to deliver basic ammunition and rations. These differences were not the result of superior American logistics planning. Though American logistics was competent, they were the result of having vastly more resources to work with. German military leaders understood intellectually that they were fighting opponents with superior industrial capacity. This understanding had informed German strategy from the beginning. The decision to seek quick victories in Poland and France, the hope that Britain would negotiate peace, the calculation that the Soviet Union could be defeated before American industrial power became fully engaged. All these strategic choices reflected German awareness that a prolonged industrial war favored their opponents, but understanding this intellectually and experiencing its concrete manifestations on the battlefield were different things. The ammunition disparity revealed the futility of certain German tactical doctrines. The emphasis on fire discipline and marksmanship, which had been rational when fighting opponents with similar constraints, became a liability when fighting opponents who had rejected those constraints. German infantry, who had been trained to fire carefully and conserve ammunition, found themselves suppressed by American infantry, who had been trained to fire freely and establish fire superiority through volume. The German approach was not wrong in any absolute sense. It was wrong for the specific war Germany found itself fighting. This pattern repeated across multiple domains. German tanks were often individually superior to American tanks in armor and armament, but American tank production exceeded German production by ratios of 5-to-1 or greater, and American logistics could keep those tanks supplied with fuel and ammunition, while German tanks frequently became immobilized for lack of fuel. German aircraft were sometimes technically advanced compared to Allied aircraft, but the Luftwaffe was overwhelmed by sheer numbers of Allied planes and by the fact that Allied air forces could replace losses, while German losses were irreplaceable. German submarines were sophisticated and deadly, but Allied shipbuilding produced cargo vessels faster than submarines could sink them. In every case, German quality and efficiency confronted Allied quantity and abundance, and quantity won. This was the fundamental strategic reality of the Second World War in Europe. After 1942, Germany could not produce enough of anything: weapons, ammunition, fuel, aircraft, ships, to match the combined industrial output of its opponents. The war became one of attrition, and attrition favored the side with more resources to attrit. German soldiers learned this truth gradually through personal experience. They learned it when resupply failed to arrive, when ammunition ran short, when promised reinforcements did not materialize, when they faced opponents who seemed to have unlimited supplies of everything. The tragedy from the German perspective was that this outcome was predictable and indeed had been predicted. German generals who had studied the First World War understood that Germany had lost at conflict because of Allied material superiority, particularly after American entry. Some of those same generals in the 1930s and early 1940s had warned that Germany could not win a prolonged war against a coalition that included the United States,